If you read the back of the bulletin this morning, you saw that I tell you there are 5 different ways or types of people who witness to those who are lost. And there's probably more than that, but I mean, these 5 come from Dr. Tom Rayner, who is president of Lifeway now. He used to be at the Southern Baptist Seminary at Louisville, and he was in a conference one time that I was at, and he began listing these ways that we worship to people. And he says everybody that is a Christian witnesses to people in one of these ways. And he listed 5 different types. And we're going to talk about that this morning because it is important for us as Christians to witness to those who are lost. We are commanded to do that. Jesus did not give us a suggestion in Matthew 28. He didn't suggest that hey, if you're not too busy, if you feel like it, go make disciples. He says, literally it translates, as you are going into the world, make disciples of all nations. As you're going about your daily life, you are to be a witness. And you're going to witness in some way. The question is, are you going to be a good witness or are you going to be a bad witness? That's really the question, because all of us as believers are a witness to who Jesus is in one way or another. It can be good or it can be bad. I mean, how many times have you had people that maybe you went out to visit or witness to or invite to church, and they begin to tell you a horror story of what happened to them in church? And I know a lot of us as believers will say, well, they're just making excuses. Well, maybe they are, but if it really happened the way they said it happened, it was inexcusable. People who have walked into church services and nobody ever speaks to them. Who walks in and maybe if someone does speak to them, maybe they were... I heard this happen one time, and it just amazes me of how we can be that way. And yet I can remember as a kid stuff like this kind of being talked about. Maybe not this directly, but a person was traveling one day and they were just stopped off. You know, it was a Sunday. They wanted to worship somewhere, but they were on their vacation. And so they just pulled into a town and pulled up to a Baptist church. We'll say it's a Baptist church because that's what we are. We have that, by the way, we have that happen quite frequently. People who are traveling Interstate 70 going east or west on vacation. We've had, over the 9 years I've been here, we've had dozens of people that have just stopped off and it was time for worship and they found our church. A lot of times they would stop out at a service station or convenience store and say, hey, where's the Baptist church? And they send them down here and they just come in. So we're just passing through and wanted to worship. And so we welcome them, we have a great time, and they get an okay sermon, and then they go on their way and enjoy their vacation. And I think every time we've had someone like that pass through here, they have been welcomed with open arms. I mean, people have been friendly and talked with them. Some of them, one of the last couples that was through here, I remember they stood here, right over here after church, after services were over, for probably 15 or 20 minutes talking with people from in the congregation. So, you know, that happens. But this one story, this man and his wife was traveling, and they stopped in to worship, and they weren't dressed for church. You know, I mean... I don't dress for church. Well, I don't dress for church, period. But you know what I'm talking about. When you're traveling, you don't dress in your suit and tie and your nice dress and heels and all that when you're traveling. Now, that's not what you wear. And so they weren't really dressed for it, but it was Sunday, and they wanted to stop and worship, and they pulled in, and they stopped at this church, and they went inside, and the people were a little distant and a little cold and a little unfriendly, and they sat down in the back like good Baptists will do. And about halfway through the music portion of the service, one of the deacons, sorry deacons, but it was a deacon, one of the deacons came back to them as the music was being sung and approached them and said, "What are y'all doing here?" And they said, "Well, we've just come, we're traveling through, we just stopped in and wanted to worship with you. You're not dressed appropriately. If you're going to come worship with us, you need to be dressed appropriate. You need to be dressed in reverence and respect to God." And essentially asking them to leave. And so what did they do? They left. They left. It's hard to imagine that happening, and yet that still happens in the world today. That there is still such a rigidity and inflexibility and legalism within so many churches today that that people who are lost and people who are unchurched feel uncomfortable being around Christians. And the only way to change that is for us to change that. You know, it's easy for us to say, well, let's make our signs more welcoming, or no. It all deals with us as people and how we bring people to Jesus. And we're going to look at a story about Jesus in the New Testament in the Gospel of John in chapter 8, the first 11 verses. And this is a story that you all know, and this is a story that, you know, I've preached many times through the years, but this is a story that talks about bringing someone to Jesus, but they're not doing it necessarily in the right way. John chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Now remember that the Pharisees have been trying to find some reason to arrest, put down Jesus. He's too popular. He's popular with the masses, and they don't like it. And so at the last part of chapter 7, they're discussing, they sent people to arrest him, and the temple guards come back and said, man, we've never heard anybody preach like this, speak like this, is what they literally say. Wow, this guy's amazing. The Pharisees were like, you're supposed to arrest him and bring him out. Now what are you, his followers? And they were just all upset. They wanted to find some reason to convict him of blasphemy or heresy so they could discredit him and get rid of Jesus Christ finally. And so we pick up this story in chapter 8, verse 1. But Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again into the temple. And all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees, his enemies, and let's remember this. Let's not forget this. That's the church people in Jesus' day. The scribes and the Pharisees. These were what we would call good church members. They followed the law. They made sure they understood the law. They went to the temple regularly. They went into the synagogue to teach and to be taught. They brought their sacrifices. They observed all the feasts. These were the 12-month out of the year religious Jewish people. These are the ones that are bringing this person to Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees in verse 3 brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the midst of the court, they said to him, Jesus, Teacher, this woman, I can just hear them saying it. Teacher, we got you now. This woman has been caught in adultery. In the very act of adultery. They were saying this, testing him, so they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down. I skipped a verse. Let me go back to verse 4. Yeah, let me check my contact, make sure. Okay, let's go back. They said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? And I imagine many of them that came with this woman as they drug her into the temple courtyard, as they drug her in and threw her down in front of Jesus with all the people that were there teaching, I'm sure many of them had a stone in his hand. A stone. Because that's what the law commanded, for her to be stoned. And probably others that as soon as they heard the charge that was brought against her, they caught her in the act of adultery, and there has to be more than 2 witnesses, and there was probably a bunch of witnesses there because they were all there. We've caught her in the act of adultery. That some of those standing around would have probably looked around and picked up a stone because they knew the law. They knew what was commanded by God. That anyone caught in the act of adultery was to be stoned. Actually, both parties were to be stoned. The man and the woman were to be stoned. They only brought the woman. They only brought the woman. Because they were, as we said in verse 6, they were testing him. They were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. Now, the sermon this morning is not about what Jesus wrote because we don't know and it doesn't matter. I don't know. He may have been drawing pictures for all I know. I've heard scholars debate this. I've heard preachers try to preach this, that he was writing down commandments. Now, we don't know, and it's not important. What was important is that they brought this woman caught in the act of adultery, threw her at the feet of Jesus so that they could have some grounds against him. Because they knew Jesus. They knew he was not going to command her to be stoned. I've never heard this preached, but do you see what their intent was? They didn't care about the adultery. They didn't care about her sin. That was not the issue here. They were looking for a way to discredit Jesus, and they knew by his teachings and who he was that he would not have her stoned. They were counting on it. They knew he was compassionate and loving and forgiving. And so they were just waiting for him to say, well, we're not going to, no. We have to forgive her. We have to love her just the way she is. And they were waiting for that because then they say, aha, you don't follow the law. You don't listen to the teachings of Moses. You're not of God because you're throwing out his commandments. And all he did was stoop down and begin to write in the sand. Because they were in the wrong. They were in the wrong. How do I know that? Look at what happens next, verse 7. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, he didn't pronounce a judgment. He just straightened up and he said these words, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, I imagine that there was probably a Pharisee or a Sadducee or scribe that was there who would be a lot like me. I just imagine this because I have a tendency, I have to be careful about this because I have a tendency to be very legalistic and very, you shouldn't do that. All you have to do is ask Michelle and Nathaniel. They try to tell me that I'm not supposed to preach all throughout the week. I'm supposed to stop preaching after Sunday. Because it doesn't matter what happens, somehow there'll be a sermon that will come to light. There'll be a verse of Scripture quoted based on something that they said or did. So I struggle with this Pharisaical nature of wanting to be very legalistic. And I imagine that there were some that were there like me thinking this thought. Well, I didn't commit adultery, and was ready to throw the stone. But the way Jesus, he said it, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And I'll guarantee you there were men standing there who were just if one person had thrown, they would have thrown. They would have felt confident enough in their own self-righteousness that, I'm not that bad of a sinner. I'm not too terrible. If anybody else throws, I'm going to throw. But no one wanted to be first. Because the first person to throw the stone was essentially condemning her to death, was passing judgment upon her. And maybe she deserved that judgment. She was caught in the act of adultery, and nowhere do we see that she denied it, so maybe she deserved it. But that first person to throw the stone was the one who was sentencing her to death. One of the Jewish traditions was that when someone was judged by one of the judges in the city to have broken a law that was to be condemned and condemn that person to death, that as they took him outside the city to stone him, that the judge who pronounced the judgment upon them would many times be the first one to throw. It didn't hold true all the time, but that many times that would be the one who threw the first stone upon the person to destroy, because that was the one who had pronounced the judgment. And if he didn't believe in it enough to cast the first stone, then maybe she wasn't or he wasn't guilty. And Jesus knew that, and he was, hey, just throw first. If you're not a sinner, just throw. And I love what happens next. He ignored them. Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began, and I think it took them a few minutes, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, the ones who should have been wise enough not to participate in this anyway. As older Christians, as Christians who are more mature in our faith, we have a responsibility to lead younger Christians to grow in their faith and become responsible Christians and become witnesses. And we're to teach that and pass that from generation to generation. And so the older ones are standing there and they're realizing that we shouldn't have had any part of it. And I've always imagined, and the last time I preached this sermon, I did this as well. I can imagine that the ground around where they were, you began to hear this. Thuds as the stones fell to the ground. And the woman is there kneeling, cowering, probably with her head covered at the feet of Jesus, caught in this humiliating place, committing a sin that she knows she did, and knowing that she deserves the judgment, and just cowering there with her face hid and her arms over her head, waiting for the stones to be cast upon her. And thud, you begin to hear stones hit the ground. And men begin to walk away. And as the older men walked away, the younger ones realized that they were sinners as well, and so they walked away. And he, Jesus, was left alone, and the woman, where she was, in the center of the court. Straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" Understand something right here. Jesus didn't say she wasn't a sinner. Jesus didn't say that what she did wasn't wrong. She had sinned. She knew she had sinned. She knew that she was guilty of a sin that was punishable by death. But he was asking, is there someone to condemn you? Is there anyone here that is willing to condemn you? And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go. From now on, sin no more." Jesus had the right to condemn her. He was the only person on the face of the earth who had a right to condemn her, and he chose not to. Why? Because we are all sinners and fall short of the glory of God. Because we all struggle to follow God's laws as best we can, but we stumble and we fall. And he says, "I'm not going to condemn you either. Go." But he says, "Go and sin no more." He didn't tell her to go back to the lifestyle that she was in that had caused her to commit adultery. He didn't tell her to go back to the way of life that was indicative of the sin that she was caught in. He said, "Go and sin no more." We don't know this, but historians and scholars through the years have tried to say that this woman was Mary Magdalene, because we know she was possessed by spirits, and more than likely, being a possessed woman in that day and age, she either was a beggar or she was a prostitute. More than likely, that was really the only rose that she had as a demon-possessed woman. And so there are some who want to say this was Mary Magdalene. It doesn't say that. We can't extrapolate that from that. But it could have been. But I believe this, whoever she was, she never stopped following Jesus after that. See, they brought her to Jesus to die. She left with eternal life. They brought her to trick Jesus into breaking the law. She left having fulfilled all of the law and the prophets, which says we can't be saved on our own. We're all sinners that struggle. So even though the Pharisees wanted her dead, and maybe Jesus discredited, maybe Jesus cast out as a teacher, maybe put down, they left the woman there at the feet of Jesus, and she was saved. The real thrust and the real point of this message for us this morning is that Your intentions may be wrong, your method may be faulty, but if you bring people to Jesus, He can and will save them. Even if you do it for the wrong reasons. Paul said, I believe it was in Philippians, he said, they're preaching Jesus, some to hurt me and some to help me. I'm in prison. I'm imprisoned here, and some are out there preaching Jesus, hoping that it'll make them mad at me, and the Roman officials will be mad at me, and they'll punish me more. And he says, some are preaching because I'm not there to preach, and so they're stepping into my place, and they're preaching the Lord Jesus. And he says, I don't care which way. Doesn't matter why they're doing it. Jesus is being preached, and people are being saved. That's what's important. So it doesn't matter how we do it, but at least that we do it. But I do think it's important for us to learn the right way to bring people to Jesus. And like I said, Dr. Tom Rayner, he listed 5 different ways in this conference. Dr. Rayner has, I think, 3 sons, and I think it's his middle son that is just he is just a go-getter when it comes to witnessing to people. He said, he said, we were on an airplane flight, and for some reason we were delayed taking off, and then as we were flying, they said, well, we're going to have to detour, so the flight's going to be longer. And his son, when he heard that, and the weather wasn't bad, so the seatbelt sign was, when he heard that, he took his seatbelt off. And Dr. Rayner said, son, where are you going? He said, hey, I just got more time to share Jesus. I mean, here's a delay, and most people are going, oh, man, we're delayed. And his son saw it as an opportunity of 200 people enclosed in a plane where they could not get away, and he could go share Jesus with them. That's the attitude that we as Christians should have, is here's an opportunity for me to be Jesus to people around me. And you fall into one of these 5 categories. And unfortunately, most people in the church today fall into this first category. And he used sea creatures to describe the way that we witness. And studies have shown that less than 10% of people in the church actively share their faith. This is the Baptist church. I don't know about other denominations, but less than 10% actively share their faith. And I think that the reason why is most of us are what we call sea anemones. You know what an anemone is in the sea? Basically looks like a plant, has tendrils that come up that float in it, and it eats anything that swims into it. Can't move, doesn't run around. It's just where it is. It's right there. And as a fish that is clownfish, if you all watch Nemo, you know what a sea anemone is. How many of you saw Finding Nemo? I mean, if all of you that have kids have seen that. That was an anemone. That's where they lived, in an anemone. Don't hurt yourself. And clownfish are immune to the poison of the anemone, so they can swim around it and live in it, and it protects them. But a fish that is not immune, if it swims into those tendrils, it gets stung by the poison there, and it becomes paralyzed, and then the anemone wraps around it, and it basically slowly digests it, and that's how it eats. And a lot of Christians, in their witnessing method, are anemones. People have to walk up to them, knock on their door, come inside, and say, I know you go to church. I want to know about Jesus. Can you tell me about them? And that's the only time they ever share their faith, is if someone just walks in on them and says, please tell me about Jesus. Or maybe their child is growing up and says, hey, Mom, Dad, what do I have to do to be saved? And if it falls in their lap, they tell them about Jesus. But that's the only time in their life they ever will. And sometimes even then they're a dead anemone, because they say, well, let me call my pastor. Because they don't even want to share to the person that's walked up and said, tell me about Jesus. And the reason our churches are plateaued and declining is because most Christians in the church today are sea anemones. Somebody has to fall into our laps before we'll ever witness to them. Dr. Rayner says that the second type is like a moray eel. If you ever know those are the real ugly eels, and they usually hide in holes or crevices in the rocks or in coral reefs. And they sit back in their hole, and they'll journey from one hole to the other, but they don't go very often. And then they sit there and they wait. And as a fish swims by their hole, they will lunge out of it and grab that fish and pull it in their hole. And that's how they feed. And again, a lot of our Christians, if they're not a sea anemone, they're a moray eel. They'll go just outside their door. They'll go. Maybe they'll work in vacation Bible school or Sunday school. And if a child or a person comes in and is around them and maybe ask a question about Jesus, then they'll grab them and they'll witness to them about Jesus. But they don't go searching for it. The person has to come near them before they'll ever tell them about Jesus. Dr. Rayner says that the third type is a barracuda. Now, if you've ever been in the Caribbean, if you've ever gone snorkeling in the Caribbean or scuba diving there, you've seen a barracuda. These are also in Finding Nemo. Barracuda is the one that got Mom. Oh, you haven't seen the movie and I just spoiled it for you, I'm sorry. But a barracuda is a solitary fish. He's a carnivore. He's a predator. But he kind of hangs around outside the reefs and out in the rocky areas. And he moves along and he waits usually until he sees a fish that's been injured or maybe more defenseless. And then he will move in and go for the attack and grab that fish that's hurt. So they're waiting. There's Christians out there that they're roaming around. They're looking for someone maybe to share Jesus with, but they want it to be the perfect one. They want it to be the right person. They don't want to just knock on anybody's door. They don't want to just walk up to someone on the street. They want to find a person that they can tell really needs Jesus. A lot of times that's where we share Jesus at the hospital. When we're in the hospital or we're visiting someone in the hospital and we see someone who is sick and hurting, those are opportunities for us to witness to them for Jesus. Ask them, hey, are you a believer? Do you know Jesus Christ? And they're weak and they're hurting and they want some hope and they want to hear about eternal life. And so it's an opportunity. So many Christians fall into that barracuda category. That's the first three. And majority of our Christians, and I don't have any kind of statistics on this, so I'm going to say 98%. We don't know. But less than 10% of Christians actively share their faith. So it's going to be fair. So most Christians fall into one of these three categories: sea anemone, moray eel, or barracuda. The last two. Dr. Rayner said, a lot of Christians, and I would put these Pharisees into this category, are sharks. They're aggressive with their witnessing technique. They see someone walking out of a bar, and they'll walk up to them with their Bible, and they'll say, hey, you know you're a sinner going to hell, don't you? This is the shark persona. You know, if you died today, you'd go to hell. You'd go straight to hell. You know why? Because you're a sinner. I know, because you're drunk. If you drink alcohol, you're a sinner, and you're going to hell. Let me tell you, let me show you you stop right there, let me show you in my Bible. Let me tell you about Jesus Christ. He died on the cross. I mean, they're aggressive with it. They just can't wait. And usually the person is like, okay, can you get away from me? I mean, they kind of run from that. But sharks range everywhere. I mean, there just was something posted on the internet a couple of weeks ago about a female shark that was off in the Caribbean, and they found it now up in the North Atlantic over toward Europe. They travel all across the oceans seeking prey, and they're aggressive with how they go after them. And they look for anybody, and they just go, and they'll grab them. And we used to have revival services years ago, and when the evangelists would come into the revival service, many evangelists are sharks. I hate to say that, but it's true. They would come in and they said, now, Pastor, I want you to line up with me some people you know who are lost and dying and going to hell, and we're going to go visit them all throughout the week of revival. We're going to invite them to church, but we're going to talk to them about Jesus. And so you go knock on the door and say, hey, I'm Pastor so-and-so, and here's Evangelist so-and-so, and we want to just meet with you. We're having a revival at a church. He's speaking, and we're just having a great time. We want to invite you to that. And then the evangelist jumps up and he says, and hey, tell me, are you going to heaven or hell? You die right now. Where are you going? Heaven or hell? Well, I don't know. I think I'll go to heaven. Well, you can't think about heaven. If you don't know, you're going to hell. I mean, that's the type of person that a shark personality. Now, they witness to a lot of people, and a lot of people get saved because of that. Because, I mean, what choice do you have? Because usually before they leave the building, they say, well, now listen, I'm going to walk out of here, and you're still lost, and you're dying, and you're going to hell in your sins. And you may not have another opportunity. God may come back, the rapture may take place, or you may die before I get out in my car. But now is your time. That's the hard sell. And so a lot of people have gotten saved. Unfortunately, I've also seen a lot of people get falsely saved under that. To get them, to leave them alone and to shut them up, they make a prayer, they pray a prayer, they go get baptized, and then they go about their life because, hey, they left me alone. They're saved now. But the fifth type of witness is the one that we all should aspire to. And this is the one that Dr. Rayner said his middle son really was. He sounds a little bit like a shark when you say, oh, I got 200 people locked in on a plane with me, so I'm going to go witness to as many as I can. But he did it in a loving way. And the fifth type of Christian, the one that we all should aspire to be, is a dolphin. How many of you like dolphins? Raise your hands. How many of you don't like dolphins? Okay, some of you don't care, but that's all right. I'm going to say, who doesn't like a dolphin? I mean, if you've ever been near the ocean or around the ocean, you see them, and I've seen enough of them. I mean, they just, as a boat is going across the ocean, dolphin will flock up to it, and it's never just one, it's 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, and they'll just leap, and they'll just come alongside, and they just can't wait. I mean, we've heard stories after stories of how people have fallen off boats, and dolphins have taken them and pushed them up and kept them afloat until the boat could come back. I mean, dolphins are great. You know, most of you know by now because it's on Facebook. Maybe I should just start preaching on Facebook. Maybe I get more people that way. That we swam with the dolphins back in February when we were in Florida. Great experience, wonderful experience. And that you think, you know, when you look at creatures like that you see on pictures, you think, oh, I bet they're wonderful. But sometimes you get up to them, they're not near as wonderful, you know, when you see them in person. But it was just as wonderful. That Hutch was his name that we swam with. He was just happy. He loved interacting with us, and he was having a great time. And it was a lot. I mean, it made you want to be a dolphin. I mean, it really did. And dolphins usually, when they're hunting for food, when they're hunting for prey, they usually work together as a team. They live in family pods, and they say that you can watch them, and as they get a group of fish that are in their area that they want to feed off of, that they will begin herding those fish into an area and basically just close in from each side and just work with one another to help catch the prey. But that's the way we ought to be as Christians. We ought to be such great Christians. We ought to love Jesus so much that people go, I don't know what you got. I don't know what's wrong with you, but I want that too. That we should be so happy and so jubilant and so excited with our lives that we're just, when somebody comes around us and we go, hey, by the way, Easter's coming up next Sunday, and I was wondering, do you go to church anywhere? No, I don't go to church. I know I should, but I don't. Well, that's okay. Now, a shark would say, you're going to hell. But a dolphin says, that's okay. Hey, you know, I know church is a habit. It's one of those things that you sometimes get out of. But you know what? Next Sunday is Easter Sunday, and we're having our pastor's going to really preach a very special message next Sunday. This is all true, by the way, so you can say all this to him I'm giving you the dialogue. Come on. What more? I'm doing the work for you. What more do you want? Matter of fact, most people, if they're any way remotely connected with church, they've heard the Easter story. They know about the crucifixion and the resurrection. And that's usually the one Sunday out of the year that a lot of people go. And so they've heard that story over. And they probably think that's the only passage in the Bible that's there, because that's the only one they've ever heard preached. And so here, you can tell them this next Sunday. They will not hear the Easter story next Sunday morning at church. I am not preaching from the resurrection or the crucifixion next Sunday morning. But I am going to preach salvation. And so I want you to, you can just say, hey, come to church with me next Sunday. I don't know, I don't have anything to wear. Well, wear whatever you want to. Matter of fact, you tell me what you're going to wear, I'll go buy a matching outfit and wear the same thing. That's what Women of Joy people do. Sorry, I had to slide that. We got some Women of Joy shirts in here this morning, so I had to throw that in there. And they had a good time, didn't you? Women of Joy was fun last week, wasn't it? Yeah. There were a bunch of dolphins there. I mean, people, instead of hearing you say, hey, I want to bring you to church next Sunday, instead of going, oh boy, they should be saying, hey man, you seem excited about this. Are you excited about being a Christian? Are you excited about having eternal life? Are you excited to be going to heaven? If you're not, what's wrong with you? I mean, really, let's talk about the lack of joy that exists within the Christian life today. Most people look at us and they go, so you've got eternal life, you know you're going to heaven, God can help you through every struggle in this world, right? Yes. Well, then why are you so depressed? Why are you so down? And we don't have an answer for that other than that we're letting the world be more a part of us than we're letting God be a part of us. Remember, greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. We need more dolphins in the church. If you had a church full of dolphins, it would be packed out with prey. Be packed out with people who are lost. Because you just want to go be... You know those people. Isn't there people that when you walk into the room with them, you just like to be around them. You enjoy their company. They're always having a good time. They always have a story to share. And I'm not talking about the annoying ones that never shut up. And that's not, there are those out there. But you know the ones I'm talking about. You just enjoy being with them. That's the kind of witnesses we need to be. We share Jesus with them because we love Him. We share Jesus with Him because He's the best thing that ever happened to us. We share Jesus with Him because He's brought joy into our lives by who He is. And we want them to have that same joy. But I don't care why you bring them or how you bring them next Sunday. I don't care whether you're an anemone or an eel or a barracuda or a shark or a dolphin. I want you all to be dolphins. And I have to work on that. I tend to be more shark-like or barracuda-like. That tends to be more my tendency. And so I tend to pull back sometimes because I'm afraid I'm going to be too harsh with them. But I don't care how you do it. Next Sunday, bring them. Bring them here and they will hear the gospel message, and they will know that they need Jesus. Just bring them. And like I said, bribe them. A dolphin would. I mean, you know why people pay way too much money to go swim with dolphins? Because it's fun. Because it's fun. What would it be like if we had people paying to come to church? What would it be like if church was such a joy and we were so excited to be here and it's just like, man, we go there every Sunday and we get our batteries recharged and we get excited and the pastor is funny sometimes and he's humorous other times and he's boring other times, but we still have a good time. And we leave it. What if we had it, our church was so exciting that we could charge admission and sell seats to get in? People will spend tons of money to go sit through a 9-inning boring baseball game. Baseball's slow for me. I'm sorry. I just can't. I like golf, but I don't like to watch it that much because it's slow too. But people will pay bukus of money to go watch a baseball game, and nobody get a hit, and they're excited that they were there. I had somebody this week telling me about how they were there when Waka almost pitched that no-hitter last year and how exciting that was. What if we were that excited about church? Do you think that would change how many people come? You got 2 ways to invite people to church this next week. You can walk up to them and you can say, next Sunday's Easter. You don't want to go to church, do you? Be honest, that's what a lot of us do. Hey, next Sunday's Easter. I know you got probably family things and you got this. You probably got an Easter egg hunt that you got to go to. So you really don't have time to go to church, do you, next Sunday? Really? Don't go in sales if that's your approach. Or you can approach them this way. Go to church or you're going to hell. You got that approach. That's not the way. I wouldn't recommend that. Taking a stone and walking and say, you're going to go to church next Sunday, you're going to hell. I think it was Tom Rayner that told a story about a pastor that pastoring a church down in Florida, and there's a man that kind of lived on the streets, kind of homeless, and the church ministered to him, and he became a believer. And didn't know much about God, didn't know much about church, but he became a believer, and he wanted to get his life right with God. And so he would come, and every Sunday he would come and he would sit on the front row. A real Christian, not all you backsliders. Is that why we sit on the back row? Because we're a little backslid? I don't know. Because they don't want him to be near me. I know what it is. But he said every Sunday he'd sit on the front row. And he just he was like a sponge, couldn't get too much of the Bible. Loved to hear the Bible, and he would talk to the pastor after. And one of those one of those new Christians that sometimes wears you out as a pastor, because he was always asking you questions about the Bible, and the pastor would always try to explain it. And then he began to realize, the pastor preached on the Great Commission. He began to realize that he had a job to do, to go out and tell others about Jesus. And so he began to look for people out on the streets that needed to know Jesus. And pastor said one Sunday he wasn't there on the front row. He wondered where he was. I'm going to call him John. I don't know what his name was. And he said it was a little unusual. And he said about halfway through the music service, John came in the back door with a guy almost literally in a headlock. Had a hold of his arm and had a hold of his neck like this. And John was a pretty big guy. And he basically, as they said, frog marched him down to the front and sat on the front pew. And John folded his arms and looked at him and said, listen. And the man sat there throughout the entire sermon, and the pastor gave the invitation, and John grabbed him and pulled him up to the pastor at the very beginning of invitation. And John told the pastor, this man's lost and he needs Jesus. And I brought him here to get saved. And the pastor said, I was kind of taking him out. I looked at the man, I said, sir, do you want to give your life to Jesus? And he said, whatever he says. Because John had found this guy on the street and drug him to church that morning so he could be saved and get to know Jesus. Now, Tom Rander said the pastor told him that he didn't necessarily get saved that morning, but they did work with him and minister to him and shared Jesus in the right way with him, and he became a believer later on. But we need people even like John, who are willing to just grab them and drag them and bribe them and say, hey, I'll feed you lunch, I'll buy you breakfast, I'll pick you up, whatever you want to do. I want you to come and experience the joy of Easter with me at church next Sunday. What would happen if instead of dreading going to church on Sunday, we were excited about it? Instead of looking at the clock at 10 o'clock on Saturday night and going, oh man, tomorrow's Sunday, we were like, hot dog. Tomorrow's Sunday. Boy, we get to get up and we get to go fellowship with other Christians and believers, and we get to have a great Sunday school lesson, and we get to hear a sermon and have music, and we just get to spend time with God. I can't wait to, man, can we just speed it up? Speed the clock up. Set it forward. I'm ready to go to church on Sunday. How do we change that? You change it here. It's not about how good the music is. It's not about how good the preaching is. It's not about how wonderful the Sunday school teachers are. It is about your attitude of why you're here. Are you here to spend time with Jesus? Because I've been in some of the lousiest musical worship services, some of the worst preaching services that you can ever imagine.